So my name is Dan Brodkin. I'm a grad student at UC Santa Cruz, and together with Justin Royer at McGill, we're going to be talking about Philippine-type voice systems and ergative anaphors. So we all know that Philippine-type languages show what we call voice systems. What's crucial for our purposes is a two-way alternation between an agent voice or anti-passive construction, where the external argument or ext is absolutive, and a patient voice, where the internal argument or int is absolutive. The system is schematized for Mandar, which is a South Sulawesi language of central Indonesia, in 1. So in this agent voice construction, we see an agent voice prefix mang, we see an absolutive agreement marker targeting the external argument, and the internal argument is indefinite. I'm reading a book. In 1b, which is a patient voice clause, we see no patient voice morpheme, but an ergative prefix and an absolutive enclitic, which indexes the internal argument. So it's just like Tagalog, except agreement is doing what nominal case marking would be doing there. Now, the morphologically absolutive argument shows systematic hierarchical privilege. And this pattern has led to near consensus in the literature that this argument sits above all others in the clause somewhere. Nevertheless, there's little agreement about the actual position that the absolutive argument sits in and what the process is which puts it in that position. So in today's talk, what we're going to do is argue for a version of the classic sort of high licensing analysis of Philippine type voice that you might be familiar with from Guilfoyle et al., on which the absolutive argument undergoes A movement to spec TP as a result of being licensed by T. So all pivots undergo A movement to spec TP, they're licensed by T. And we show that this analysis allows the voice system of Philippine type languages to be understood as a very typical sort of high absolutive system of the type that recurs cross-linguistically. What this will lead us to is a discussion of anaphors, right? So having adopted this stance, we turn to a puzzle. In the patient voice, reflexive anaphors basically can never be external arguments. This is an old observation of Anderson's that Keenan reports for Malagasy, Tagalog, and Batak. I've shown this in 2. So here we have a patient voice clause that shows an ergative anaphor, something like myself respects me in Mandar. This is totally ungrammatical. The same judgments are reported for Tagalog, so himself slapped him, not good. So some have taken this pattern to suggest that the thing that puts the internal argument in its high position in a patient voice clause is not a movement, right? It's a bar movement or it's no movement. We argue against this view. We say the patient voice internal argument does undergo a movement. Ergative anaphors are ruled out by a separate set of constraints, okay? So that is the idea. This tree in 3 shows what we believe the syntax of a patient voice clause to be, and underlies our assumptions about Philippine type syntax more broadly. We argue, as I mentioned, that the absolutive argument systematically undergoes a movement to spec TP. We take this step to be a byproduct of a licensing relationship between the absolutive argument and T. And we link definiteness effects of the type that we see in Tagalog, but not Malagasy, to a separate and lower step of object shift that does not place the internal argument in a patient voice clause above the external argument. So just to recap, we have object shift, and then the thing that puts the pivot or absolutive in its high position is a relationship with T, a licensing relationship. Now, many Philippine type languages provide evidence from binding that the pivot or absolutive does undergo a movement to this high position. We can see this with variable binding in all of these languages, as I've shown from Mandar in the past. We can also see this with the profile of condition C violations. So if we look at the distribution of pronouns and co-referential R expressions in Mandar, we see that R expressions in the ergative, or patient voice ext, cannot be indexed with co-referential absolutive pronouns. In other words, you cannot say something like, Nina's mom saw her, right? The absolutive object induces a condition C violation over an R expression inside of the ergative. Note there, you can't say Nina's mom saw her. And we also see on the other side of the same coin that R expressions in the absolutive can be co-indexed with ergative pronouns. So you can say things like, she'll read the book that Nina bought earlier, where she and Nina have bear the same referential index. So all of these things suggest that the absolutive argument undergoes a movement to a high position. Now, Mandar and its relatives, all the languages of Sulawesi, provide a morphological clue that T is somehow relevant to this movement. So in these languages, the absolutive argument triggers absolutive agreement, and all of the literature has sort of assumed or argued that this agreement sits on T. We can see this in a bunch of ways. Here I've listed 2. The absolute of agreement marker follows middle field auxiliaries. It occupies a high linear position, and it goes away in non-finite contexts. So I've shown the first thing in 5a. If we have something like he already visited me, our agreement marker follows an auxiliary. And in 5b, we have a non-finite clause, I want to work, and there's no agreement in the non-finite clause. These things suggest that the absolute of argument triggers agreement on T, and this lets us build up toward the theory where the absolute of argument undergoes a movement as a result of its relationship with T. All right, Justin, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. So Dan just showed us good evidence in Mandar that the internal argument systematically raises above the external argument, right? So this is the high absolutive schema. And what we want to say here is that this is not unique to Philippine type languages. Actually, this pattern recurs systematically across morphologically ergative languages, or a subset of them at least. So in the Mayan language family, Inuit, Salish, West Circassian, etc. So in a subset of these languages, the absolute argument appears to undergo a movement above all arguments in the clause, with consequences, for example, for condition C. And the absolute argument shows morphological evidence of interaction with the head of TP. And we're going to say that all these languages share high absolutive syntax. And we're going to show a similarity between Mandar and Chuch, Mayan languages. So there are striking similarities there. So Chuch is a high absolutive language from the Canjobalan family of Mayan languages. It's spoken by roughly 70,000 speakers in Guatemala and Mexico. And it has a lot of striking similarities with Mandar. So it shows ergative absolutive agreement, and it has no case marking on nominals. It also shows a diathesis between agent voice and patient voice. Now, of course, this is not what it's called in Mayanist literature, but really we seem to have a parallel. We have what we call an antipassive in Mayan languages with the antipassive suffix, which looks like the agent voice, and we get absolutive agreement here. And we have a transitive sentence here with ergative agreement, which looks more or less like the patient voice. And so in Chuch, just like in Mandar, we find strong evidence for a movement of the internal argument above the external argument. For example, we see condition C effects. So let's look at the examples in 7. In 7, we see that an R expression, so the key thing to notice in 7a is that an R expression contained inside the absolutive is co-indexed with the ergative subject. Now, this wouldn't make sense if the ergative subject would asymmetrically C-command the absolutive, but if it makes sense if the absolutive asymmetrically C-commands the ergative, right? So we don't expect a condition C violation here. We can show the converse also. So a pronoun in the absolutive cannot be co-indexed with an R expression inside the ergative, because this leads to a condition C violation if the absolutive systematically races above the ergative. So just like in Mandar, we see a link with licensing by T. So the absolutive agreement follows perfective marking, so a spectral marking. You can see this in 8a. So this is reminiscent of what we saw for Mandar. And also, you can't get a transitive sentence in a non-finite embedded clause with absolutive agreement, right? You need to use a different construction. And this makes sense if non-finite clauses lack T, and T is what licenses absolutive arguments. Okay. So the patterns that we've seen above lead us to clear theory. The absolutive argument undergoes a movement to spec TP, like Dan argued. But at the beginning, we saw a puzzle for this, right? Neither language allows an absolutive argument to bind a reflexive anaphor in the position of the external argument. So neither Mandar nor True can you say myself saw me or himself saw Shu. You don't get ergative anaphors. So we're going to call this this pattern the ban on ergative anaphors, which to our knowledge holds across ergative languages. And crucially, in previous work, the ban on ergative anaphors has been taken to provide evidence against either movement of the internal argument above the external argument, so high absolutive syntax, or a movement of the internal argument as opposed to a bar movement. So the idea with a bar movement is that the anaphor reconstructs, right? Now, we're going to argue that this logic doesn't go through Instead, we propose that ergative anaphors are ruled out for independent reason. We're going to explore two reasons. One is that the anaphors are exceptionally low, so they have to remain below the VP. Another is in other languages, we'll see that there's evidence that the anaphor behaves like other objects. It raises above the external argument, but we'll see that post-government and binding approaches to binding anyway predict that there shouldn't be ergative anaphors independently. And so the conclusion we're going to arrive at is that the ban on ergative anaphors doesn't provide an argument against the A movement analysis. Oh, and as a side note here, we're dealing with condition A anaphors in both Mandar and Chuch. These are anaphors that must be locally C-commanded by their antecedent, right? So we're not going to talk more about this data here, but these are two condition A anaphors in both Mandar and Chuch. Okay, so much work has shown that non-exempt reflexive anaphors do not form a homogeneous class. For example, Elena Paul shows in Malagasy that there are two kinds of anaphors, NP anaphors and DP anaphors. And across high absolutive languages, we can observe minimally two types of anaphors, sometimes coexistent within the same language. So in some languages, the anaphor behaves like a regular argument. So it shows the same distributional properties as other types of internal arguments. And in the languages which show the definiteness effect, like Mandar and Tagalog, it typically occurs with patient voice as expected. So we have examples here of Mandar and Tagalog in 12A and B. Now, in other high absolutive languages, we have anaphors which show different behavior than regular internal arguments. So in Chuch, for instance, anaphors show constraints that regular DPs do not. They have a very limited distribution. They only ever appear in the internal argument position. And there's no exempt use. They can't appear inside PPs. This is what 13 shows us. A second important observation is that they generally must be verb adjacent. So VSO, as you can see in 15b there at the bottom right, is sometimes possible in Chuch. And actually, in this case, it's the preferred word order. But VSO is never possible with a reflexive object. And actually, there are Mayan languages that exhibit rigid VSO word order, and VOS is enforced when the object is an anaphor. Now, from an Austronesianist perspective, this might not be surprising, right? Because Ba resembles low anaphors or structurally reduced anaphors that we find across Austronesian, such as Tena in Malagasy or Didi in Indonesian. And in fact, we find that the anaphor in Chuch with the anaphors in these languages share several systematic properties. So we already saw that they're restricted. They only appear in internal argument position. They don't have exempt uses. This is also the case for Tena and Didi. They generally have to be verb adjacent, also the case for Tena and Didi. They cannot appear in focus position. So we have an example here in 17. The anaphor in Chuch cannot appear in focus position, nor can Tena and Malagasy. And finally, low anaphors cannot occupy the high absolutive position. And so this is handled in different ways in different languages. So in Austronesian, low anaphors have to appear as the internal argument of the agent voice and not of the patient voice, right? This is what we see in 19. But in Mayan, we can get the equivalent of the patient voice morphology, so the transitive sentence. And what we see in this case is that the external argument can exceptionally extract, right? So this is evidence really that the anaphor stays low, right? Normally, ergative extraction is not possible in Chuch. Right? And finally, yeah, it's relevant to note here that some Mayan languages require anti-passive morphology when the internal argument is reflexive. So we have another neat parallel between Austronesian and Mayan. So our proposal is pretty basic here. We just want to say that these low anaphors cannot appear in positions outside the VP. This just seems like a descriptive fact. And this pattern may be derived from independent constraints. For example, patterns of nominal licensing. Paul 2004 shows that the Tena anaphor in Malagasy could be is an NP anaphor. So perhaps it's licensed differently than regular DPs. And then another possible reason for the difference could be like derivational properties of the anaphors. Maybe the anaphors are incompatible with high or high absolutive syntax. And this is something I've proposed in recent work and that we'll touch a bit upon in the next section. But the crucial point is the fact that the anaphors must remain low rules out their appearance as the external argument of patient voice constructions. And I'll pass the word to Dan again.
All right, thanks a bunch, Justin, for that exceedingly clear walkthrough. So now let's turn back to the languages that do allow reflexive anaphors to appear as normal patient voice objects, namely Tagalog, Mandar, so on and so forth. In the absence of the stay low constraint, there are many, many ways that we could rule out ergative anaphors, and this is a necessary goal for many Philippine-type languages. So what we would like to claim is that actually most post-government and binding approaches to reflexive binding actually predict that ergative anaphors should be systematically impossible. So we'll show this first with a domain constraint model or something like phase-based anaphor binding. So there's this classic intuition in the old literature on reflexive anaphors that anaphors have to be bound. Reflexive anaphors need antecedents that occur within particular domains, particular small constituents. In modern terms, we might link these particular constituents to phases, right, and try to assimilate reflexive binding to phase theory. We might propose a constraint like 21, much like Sadik and Bryant 2021, a phasal binding constraint, which says condition A anaphors have to be bound within the first phase in which they're merged, or the smallest possible phase. This constraint would completely rule out ergative anaphors on two uncontroversial assumptions. One, that there is a clause internal phase, that's something like the voice P, or smallest projection that contains the external argument. And two, that the internal argument does not move above the external argument within this phase in the patient voice. The first of these assumptions reflects the basic intuition of Chomsky 86's proposal, which is that anaphors have to be bound within the smallest complete functional complex or thing that contains an external argument. And the second assumption, that there is no object shift that puts the internal argument above the external argument within the voice P, has independent justification in Mandar. I will be talking about this on Friday. So we illustrate this tree in 22. Here we just have what's important, a voice P that is a phase, an external argument that is above the internal argument within the voice P, and then a ban on binding a reflexive anaphor in this position on the part of a constituent outside of this phase, right? So a phase-based binding constraint says it correctly rules out the presence of ergative anaphors if we assume that the internal argument is below the external argument within the voice. Now, this type of analysis actually does make other predictions, and these predictions are correct, at least in Mandar. So we might predict that there should be no anaphors in positions that lack phase internal antecedents, right? So when we look at other phases, we find this is correct. In Mandar, it's completely impossible for the reflexive anaphor AFLA28 to occur inside of complex DPs, and it is completely impossible to occur inside of all types of PP. So any kind of PP, it's completely impossible to put this anaphor inside of it. This is a complex DP. I like photos of myself. This is totally bad. 23B shows just a regular PP. The anaphor cannot occur inside of it. A phase-based model of anaphor binding gets this pattern, given two assumptions. These things are phases, and neither contains a legitimate antecedent for the anaphor. I've schematized this here. So the DP is a phase. The external argument cannot bind the possessor of a DP, like photos. PP is a phase. The internal argument of trust cannot bind a DP inside of this PP at myself or to myself. So a phase-based model of binding constraints correctly rules out the presence of ergative anaphors and makes other good predictions about their distribution in Mandar. Nevertheless, we note that you could achieve the same result on any sort of minimalist model of binding, minimalist model of anaphors that derives the reflexive relationship from something derivational, namely an agree-based approach or a movement-based approach. So Levin 2014 has shown that an agree-based approach can derive the ban on ergative anaphors in Balinese. That works. And we note that movement-based approaches derive the ban on ergative anaphors through their basic operational logic. So movement-based approaches to reflexive anaphors basically say, well, the reflexive anaphor is something inside of the internal argument that is stranded by movement of the possessor to the position of the external argument. So you strand self here, or myself, and then you move the possessor to this high position. Now, if this is the way that anaphors are derived by movement that strands something into a thematic position and moves into a thematic position, and movement is always upward, and the external argument is base generated above the internal argument, then there is basically no way to derive an ergative anaphor on a movement-based approach, right? So there is no way for a subpart of the external argument to move into the base or thematic position of the internal argument, yielding an ergative anaphor, given sort of normal assumptions about syntax and rejecting the sort of old deep ergativity hypothesis in 27. The idea is phase-based approaches derive the ban on ergative anaphors, the derivational logic, or the logic of derivational-based approaches do as well. Okay, so what have we shown? Well, we've tried to argue that the ban on ergative anaphors makes sense. It is readily derived on multiple theories of reflexive anaphora. And as a result, we should not take the absence of ergative anaphors in a given language as evidence against movement of the absolutive internal argument to a position above the external argument, or a movement of the absolutive argument to this high position. In other words, the absence of ergative anaphors does not provide an argument against a movement of the absolutive argument. What does this bias? Well, it removes an apparent challenge for the a movement analysis of the voice system and allows us to understand the position of the absolutive argument in terms of straightforward a movement to the specifier of TP. This analysis is good, we maintain, for several reasons. It captures the unique binding privilege of the absolutive argument in Philippine-type languages, and it captures the link between movement into this position and interaction with T that we see in languages of Sulawesi and has been proposed to be visible in other languages as well. The same analysis, we also note, readily extends to high absolutive systems cross-linguistically. So Philippine-type languages are not the only languages where the absolutive argument appears to occupy a high A position. So the absolutive argument has been noted to show the same types of privilege with respect to binding, agreement, A-bar extraction, and so on and so forth in Mayan, Inuit, Salish, West Circassian, Algonquian, and probably other languages as well. And this pattern, the fact that the absolutive argument seems to sit in this high A position, exists independent of the question of morphological ergativity. So this does not hinge on an ergative analysis. The point is that all of these languages contain a basic transitive construction or set of transitive constructions where different types of argument undergo a movement to a high position, a position above all other arguments in the clause. And we argue that all of these patterns are best explained on a high absolutive analysis of the voice system or Philippine-type syntax more broadly, where the absolutive argument or pivot undergoes a movement to spec TP as a byproduct of interaction with T. The absence of ergative anaphors does not provide an argument against that analysis. Okay, thank you. I will.
All right, thank you for that talk. We have around 7 minutes for questions. As usual, please use the raise hand function or post your question in the chat and I will read it out. I see a question from Edith. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for that really interesting talk. I have 2 very short questions. One of them you might discuss in your talk on Friday, and that is the mechanics of how you move the absolutive object over the external argument in the spec of voice P, given your strict view of phase-based locality. If you're going to talk about that on Friday, just say I'm going to talk about that on Friday. Then the other question is, how do you know that all of these quote unquote Philippine type languages are high absolutive? So the Formosan languages most assuredly are, the Indonesian languages, including the Sulawesi languages, probably are. I certainly expect diachronically for them to be. But not all of the classic Philippine languages are. So there's a divide. Cebuano is high, Tagalog is not high. And so, and also, hey, I mean, movement to spec TP, that's kind of funny for the word order. So those are my questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these great questions. I will address the phase thing on Friday. So hopefully we can set that aside. With regard to the question of word order, yeah, I'm not committed to any sort of analysis of word order as syntactic. There may just be rampant right word scrambling. I think what matters here is hierarchical asymmetries between arguments. as diagnosed by patterns of binding and coreference and maybe A-bar extraction. Someone might have a more intelligent theory of word order that makes this work. We could imagine predicate fronting around spec TP, as in Guilfoyle, Hung, and Travis. Actually, no, maybe that wasn't claimed there, but in various other Paul and Travis papers. With regard to the question of, are all of these languages high absolutive? I would not like to make claims about Formosan languages. Within Sulawesi, there are very consistent patterns that line up neatly with Mayan and other high absolutive languages.
They are, for sure. That I wouldn't be I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were, yeah.
Mm-hmm. With regard to the arguments about low absolutive syntax in Philippine type languages, are these connected to the presence of absolutive marking on like non-finite patient voice clauses on the internal arguments of, is that what the argument comes from?
That's certainly part of the argument, yes. And that also is one of Julie Leggett's classic arguments that she and I were working with about the same time. So, I mean, so that question definitely has to be addressed. Otherwise, all ergative languages just end up being high abs, which actually I'm working with that hypothesis right now, but these old questions have to be resolved, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we'll take our success with the languages of Sulawesi and
sure.
Maya and move forward from there.
Okay, thanks.
If there are if no one has a question at the moment, I think I have a short question. So I guess I'm not sure, given Edith's comment about Tayab's languages, I'm not sure what you say regarding the status of Tagalog as a high abs language, but I do note that I was looking at when you presented the kind of the phase behavior and the fact that in Mandar the reflexives can't appear in possessor position or as say the complements of PP. In Tagalog they can. So I'm wondering what your thoughts about Tagalog specifically are.
That's a good question. What kind of PPs can they occur in? Like, is it just, or is it like?
My sort of right now intuition is that they just can appear in anything. I think any PPs.
Right. Well, I mean, the phasal status of PP, right, is an open question. And with regard to like the precise typology of anaphors and potential logophoric uses of apparent reflexive anaphors in these languages, right, like that requires very careful work to parcel out what exactly can be a logophore and what cannot. In Mandar, it's exceedingly clear that there are basically not anaphoric uses for the relevant thing. I mean, you can get it in a particular poetic register, and you can get it if you make the anaphor bigger. But the idea of sort of phase-based binding, like the proposal is, well, the idea of extension Tagalog is really a promissory note, right? The idea is that we can get the right constraints on a phase-based model if we look at something that we know that we're absolutely positive is not an exempt anaphor, and the precise constraints that hold over things that are logophoric, we set aside.
Okay, thanks. And I have a comment from Sandy Chung. Very interesting talk, Justin and Dan. You might want to look at Samoan, which allows ergative anaphors in quotes, although the anaphors are not morphologically distinguishable from ordinary pronouns. We have time for one more quick question. So if anyone has anything quick, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we can head to the break early. All right, I guess that's it for this session. Let's thank our speakers and reconvene at 10